If you just do it, it'll turn out okay. Hey everyone, back to Talk Time Caffeine, episode 299. And today is a guest all the way back from season 3, Kyle Alexander, aka Christian Idealism. Last time he was on, we had a 6-part discussion with him, but now he's back to talk about what he's learned in this 4 years I had him last. So how you been?
Pretty good. I've been doing a lot of research in a lot of different fields. Specifically, philosophy is my major, so that's the field that I study the most now.
Oh, so what have you learned in philosophy?
There's a lot. So in philosophy, I mean, there's three general fields. So the first one is metaphysics, which deals with questions about ultimate reality. What is the nature of things, right? Metaphysics is where you also have like subfields, like you have the philosophy of religion, you have the philosophy of science as well. You also have, the philosophy of mind in there as well. So metaphysics is just a general term for dealing with questions about ontology, with the nature of things. And then there's epistemology, which deals with questions about what is knowledge, right? So how do we know things? How do we come to know things? Are we justified in our belief system, right? And then, of course, there's ethics. So the last field of philosophy would be ethics, which deals with questions about morality, what is right and wrong, do right and wrong even exist, stuff like that. So those are the three general fields of philosophy. And for me, I particularly the two fields, or technically three fields I study mainly. One is the philosophy of science, which right now I'm getting my degree in general philosophy, but I'm going to have an emphasis on the philosophy of science. The second one is going to be the philosophy of religion, which I also study. And then, of course, the philosophy of mind, which the philosophy of mind deals with questions about consciousness, right? So those three fields, in my opinion, are probably the most important. So philosophy of religion deals with questions about God. Philosophy of mind deals with questions about the consciousness. And the philosophy of science deals with questions about methodology. How are we supposed to evaluate those sorts of things?
Okay.
So my presentation today is going to be a combination of all three of those elements. Although the philosophy of mind aspect won't be there as much, but the philosophy of religion and the philosophy of science are going to be a big part of the presentation I'm going to present today, which has to do with theistic arguments. So, what are the arguments that philosophers use when arguing for and against the existence of God? So we're not going to be looking at just one side. We're going to be looking at the other side as well. I'm going to try to be as unbiased as I can. I do admit that from the face of it, I am a theist. I'm a Christian theist. I'm a Catholic. So, I apologize if I may seem biased towards belief in God, but hopefully today I could sort of present these arguments and sort of just look at it from a theoretical perspective.
And why you okay, question for you before we start. I just because you think other people are arguing it wrong or something, or
yeah, that's my main point. So the main point of my goal today is to show why there's these arguments, right? But then I think that the way that a lot of people have argued for and against God has been mistaken, right? So hopefully today I can present a sort of I'm going to conclude with two general views that one could take when assessing the existence of God, right? And near the end, I might have to, because I wasn't able to completely finish the presentation, but hopefully I'm able to explicate what I have to say near the end.
okay.
So yeah.
I will share your screen or slide, and I will mute myself and see where we go from here.
All right. Everyone see that?
Yep.
Okay, so we're gonna start off with how arguments work. So just very, very basic logic, right? So arguments are sets of propositions that, if valid, would lead to a particular conclusion, right? So you can have any number of arguments. So a valid argument would be an argument is valid when the propositions logically lead one to a conclusion. So example, if P then Q, P therefore Q. again, you could put P or Q, so that could represent anything, right? You could say, I don't know, like if Socrates is moral, then Socrates is a man. Premise 2, Socrates is moral. Conclusion, therefore Socrates is now. Again, that's just one example of a valid argument. And you could also have what's called a sound argument, which is when an argument is valid and its premises are true. So even if you have a valid argument, that doesn't mean that it's a sound argument, right? So you could have an argument that's valid, and let's say, I don't know, the conclusion is false or something. Well, it's still a valid argument. It's just not sound, right? Or what you could have is you could have an unsound argument and an unvalid argument, and the conclusion is still true, right? So sometimes you might have an argument that's both unsound and unvalid, but yet the conclusion is still true, right? Again, I don't want to spend too much time on this because this is just basic logic, right? And typically when philosophers, when they present arguments, this is the typical format that they use, although there are other sort of syllogisms that you could follow. This is just the most basic one you can follow. And then there's also different types of arguments, right? So as I explained earlier, there's a difference between a valid and sound argument. So a valid argument would say that all cats are pink. That's premise 1. Premise 2, Felix is a cat, therefore Felix is pink. Now the issue is that's a valid argument, but obviously cats aren't pink, which makes the first premise untrue. So premise 1 would be untrue. It wouldn't be a true premise, but the argument's still valid, right? And so, validity sort of, in order for validity, all that requires for something to be valid is that it just logically follows, right? But just because it's valid does not mean it's true, right? So I could present a valid argument for God or against God, but that doesn't mean that it's sound, right? It doesn't mean it's the sound argument, right? Whereas there's a sound argument, which you have, it's both valid and the premises are true, right? So premise 1, anthrax is not a communicable disease. Premise 2, communicable diseases pose the greatest threat to public health. Conclusion, therefore, anthrax does not pose the greatest threat to public health. Okay. So that's a sound argument, right? Because the premises are true and the conclusion logically follows from those premises, right? So if you have a set of premises that lead to conclusion, right, then it's just true that conclusion is true. And there's also there's different types of arguments. So there's deductive arguments, there's inductive arguments, and then there's abductive arguments. Now, these particular examples are deductive, right? But sometimes you might have arguments that sort of use inductive reasoning, right? You might say that it's most likely the case that this is true.
So what's the difference between these three things, adductive, deductive, and inductive?
So deductive is where the premises are true, so the conclusion must be true. Okay, it's just logically follows. It's it's just there's no avoiding the conclusion, basically. With induction, it's different because what induction does is it looks at an observation, right? Looks at, I don't know, like let's say one example might be premise 1. 90% of humans have hair or something, right?
Okay.
You say Kyle is a human, therefore Kyle most likely has hair. Okay. That's an inductive argument. Now, does it mean that I have hair? No, right? Maybe I'm bald, right? But the point is that it's using inductive reasoning to conclude that it may be true that Kyle has hair given the observations we have, right? Just given the knowledge that Kyle is a human, right? You can conclude, therefore, it's most likely the case that Kyle has hair. But that doesn't mean that therefore, doesn't mean that Kyle therefore has hair. It just means that therefore Kyle most likely has hair, given the observation that.
Okay.
And then abductive reasoning is a little bit more complicated. So abductive reasoning just mainly has to do with likelihoods, right? So typically this has to do with the best explanation for a certain phenomena, right? And in this case, abductive reasoning is very similar to induction, except that abduction is sort of like reaching the best conclusion or the best theory given a set of premises, right? And so it's a little bit more complicated there. But I also think that abduction is sort of like, we use an everyday reasoning, right? I mean, we always try to find the best sort of I don't know, like explanation of phenomena, given our observations about the world, right? Hold on, someone. I apologize if you can hear background, but
technical
anyways,
difficulties is a thing.
Yeah, but anyways, I hope the audience can sort of understand that these are just the general three general ways to look at arguments, right? And so now with theism, it gets a little more, then we ask, hey, well, is there a God, right? People always ask that question, right? And throughout this presentation, I'm going to refer to theism as that there is a God. And then when I say naturalism, I say that there is no God. Or, when I talk about naturalism, I'm going to say the hypothesis or any metaphysical hypothesis without God. Okay. So when the theist argues for phenomena such as the existence of the universe or some feature of the universe to the existence of God, they are arguing that such an explanation can be made intelligible to the nature of God, and that such a phenomena is more likely expected under the theistic hypothesis, which is the God hypothesis, right? If you view theism as a sort of hypothesis. And of course, when the atheist argues from phenomena such as the existence of the universe or some feature of the universe to the existence of God, they are arguing that such an explanation cannot be made intelligible to the nature of God, and that such a phenomena, whatever it is, right, is more likely expected under a naturalistic hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that says that there is no God, or it precludes the existence of God, right? So these are the two general, at least in the philosophy of religion per se, these are the two like rival views. Now there is a third view. I'm not going to get into here, but basically the third view says that things exist because it's good for them to exist. Now, luckily, the good thing for us is that most philosophers don't take that view seriously. So I'm not going to get much into it, if you know what I mean. Are there any questions before I continue?
No,
Or
not really.
Okay. I just want to make sure that people understand what I.
Yeah, I'm a little distracted too. Like I said, I'm while you're talking, I'm also trying to get my this thing fixed with my order I got. But yeah, I heard everything you said. No questions from me at this point.
Okay, so another thing before I look into the arguments, right, is that naturalism and theism are both metaphysical theories about the world. Okay, so metaphysical theory is a theory that attempts to explain all of causal reality and has a final stop point for explanation. And so I also want to point out that this stopping point also goes beyond empirical science, as it deals with questions regarding contingency, brute facts, necessities, and further questions regarding a thing's nature, right? So when we start talking about a thing's nature, you're not going to be able to answer those type of questions on a purely empirical basis, just by the fact because empirical science deals with questions about how things behave, but they're not going to deal with questions about what things actually are, right?
Okay.
They're also not going to deal with questions about whether or not there are brute facts about the world, or whether or not there's necessities about the world. And I'll get more into necessities later, but the point I want to make here is that science is strictly confined to telling us how things behave and not about the nature of things themselves. And so science explains the behaviors of causal things, but it doesn't actually tell us why there are causal things in the first place, or why the causal things have their natures, or why it has the natures that it does, right?
Okay.
And so what metaphysics does is it actually attempts to answer these sorts of questions, right? So as an example, let's say that there is no God. Let's say that naturalism is true. And let's just say that, I don't know, the universe is a brute fact. Okay. Now that conclusion that the universe is a brute fact, that's a metaphysical conclusion. That's not something you can show through the scientific method. Right?
Yeah.
So it has to be that's the stopping point, right? But that stopping point is not a scientific stopping point. That's a metaphysical stopping point. So the moment that you make a claim like that, you're already in the realm of metaphysics. So you're already dealing with metaphysical claims, right? Whereas science is just not going to be able to tell you that. It's not going to tell you whether or not something is brute fact or not, right? It doesn't deal with those sorts of questions, right? So I just want to point this out, that when we're dealing with questions about metaphysics, we are dealing about these type of questions, right? So anyways, let's continue then. So asking why we see this set of properties rather than another set of properties in this world, that's a metaphysical question. On naturalism, why should it be more likely than not that things would appear as they are? Why is there no things that are deceiving? Why can it just appear as if there is a benevolent being or a God in reality when there is no God, right? So, why can't it be the case that God exists in our perceptions, but then in reality there is no God that's actually there, right? And so answering these type of questions requires metaphysics, right? So, and I also need to point out that metaphysics would also have to preclude the possibility of these type of skeptical scenarios, because you could always bring them up, right? A skeptic can just always come around and say, well, what about this situation or that situation? Well, the point is that these situations are precluded by your metaphysical hypothesis. They're not going to be precluded by scientific hypotheses, right? And so because metaphysics deals with questions about ultimate reality, then skeptical scenarios like the ones I just pointed out here can be avoided, right? And so metaphysics in that sense has a sort of wider scope. It can answer more questions that science wouldn't be able to, at least empirical science wouldn't be able to. So now let's go into arguments for and against God. So arguments for the existence of God come into following classification: ontological arguments, cosmological arguments, teleological arguments, moral arguments, and so on, right? And arguments against God come in forms of the problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness. And again, there's a lot of other arguments, which maybe we'll get into, but I just want to point that out, that they're, these are the general classifications that people talk about when they're talking about arguments, right? Especially with dealing with God. So the first argument is, well, actually, this is an argument. I'm sorry. This is just definitions, right? So
Okay.
keep these in mind when I go through the presentation. If you need to pause and take a picture, if anyone's watching, then go right ahead. But yeah, something that's contingent, something that could exist, in some possible worlds and not others. Something that's necessary, it's something that exists in all possible worlds, right? And so what I mean by possible world is just ways that things could have been different due to the laws of logic. Like it's metaphysically possible that something else could have, like, I don't know, like maybe it's possible that I could have long hair or something in some other possible world, right? That's an example of a possible world. Whereas an impossible world is something that cannot exist, right? So, like, for example, like a married bachelor or a square circle or something like that, right? So these are the sort of definitions that I just want to clarify people on. But anyways, let's continue on. So the first argument is an ontological argument. It's a modal ontological argument. So premise 1, it is possible that God exists. Premise 2, if it is possible that God exists, then God exists in some possible worlds. Again, possible world just in the sense of, again, it's just like there's a possible state of affairs by which God can exist. Premise 3, if God exists in some possible worlds, then God exists in all possible worlds. Premise 4, if God exists in all possible worlds, then God exists in the actual world. Premise 5, if God exists in the actual world, then God exists, therefore God exists. Now, I just want to clarify that I do not endorse this argument. I'm not a fan of this argument for several different reasons.
So is this like a domino effect thing here? Like,
yeah. So, okay. So, and the one clarification I want to point out here, when I say possible, I'm talking about metaphysical possibility, right? So it's metaphysically possible that God exists. Now, some people might say, well, what are the premises that you can dispute? Well, in my mind, you can only dispute the first premise. The other premises just follow from modal logic. Okay. Now, why is that the case? Well, if we define God as a necessary being, right, then by definition, God exists in all possible worlds, right? Because if we define God in a way where it's, like if God exists in some possible worlds, he has to exist in all possible worlds given his necessity, right? So the only premise that I think you can dispute would be premise 1, which is that it's possible that God exists. And in fact, there are there are arguments that but they're called symmetry breakers. But basically, what you could do is you could use a reverse ontological argument, right? So you could say that it's possible that God does not exist, right? And then you could then use the same exact argument just in reverse, right? And say that God does not exist.
So, but without the first domino, does that mean the other dominoes can't fall then?
Well, that's the thing. So, if it's possible that God exists, if it's metaphysically possible that God exists, then God exists by necessity, given that God is a necessary being, right?
Yeah.
The God by his nature has to exist in all possible worlds. So, if you accept the metaphysical possibility that God exists, then God exists, right? Now, again, I don't endorse this argument. I don't think it works because you have to show the first premise to be true. But I will say that there are symmetry breakers, which means there are ways you could argue one way or the other, basically, right? And again, there's a lot of literature on this, but my point is, like, this is an ontological argument, so this is purely metaphysical, right? It's purely dealing with questions about modality, possible worlds, stuff like that, right? But you're right in the sense that it is a domino effect. So if you accept the possibility that God exists, right, then that's it. The argument goes through, right?
Yep.
So I sort of like this argument because it sort of like it points out like a red flag for the atheist. So if an atheist doesn't want to believe in God for whatever reason, right? The only premise that they're going to be able to dispute is premise 1, right? So they have to reject premise 1 if they want to be consistent, basically.
Mhm.
So I just want to point that out. Again, I don't endorse this argument. I don't think it works. But I just want to point it out. It's just one example of an ontological argument. The next type of argument is, okay, this is Gödel's argument. Now, I don't want people to be scared about the language on the right here. So that's just right here. That's just symbolic logic. So you can ignore that. You don't have
So
to.
who is Gödel? How do you pronounce it?
Gödel is a mathematician. He's the one that came up with the incompleteness theorem back in I can't remember the exact year. It was like early 1900s. But he came up with this argument, and I haven't looked too much into this argument to say anything about it, at least in my personal taste. But basically, when it's talking about positive, right, it's talking about something that's positive in its nature, so something that's valuable, right? And so, we have premise 1, either a property or its negation is positive, but not both. So you can have something that's both positive and not positive, right? Something that's both maximally great and not maximally great, or something that's both God and not God, essentially. Premise 2, a property necessarily implied by a positive property is positive, right? So if you have a positive property, it just entails its positivity. Again, that's just the law of identity, right? Premise 3, positive properties are possibly exemplified, which just says that it's possible that they could be exemplified. Therefore, a godlike being possesses all positive properties. So this is just a definition, right? So that's another definition 1, which is that a godlike being possesses all positive properties, which I think that's a true premise. Then you have premise. I think it's 1, 2, 3, 5. I think. Well, it's not put into premises here, but it sort of follows the same line. The property of being godlike is positive, right? That's just an entailment, and so possibly God exists. Okay. Now the question is, whether or not this line of argument works, right? And so it gets a little complicated because once you get down to this premise, which is A4 in this case, you would have to argue that something that's positive is necessarily positive, right? Which that's where I think the debate's going to come in here. But anyways, so in essence, of an individual is a property possessed by it and necessarily implying of any of its properties. So being godlike is the essence of any godlike being, which again, that's just a definition. Necessary existence is an individual is the necessary exemplification of all its existence, which basically means that something that necessarily exists just exemplifies that necessary existence. And so therefore, necessary existence is a positive property, and so necessarily God exists. Now, there's been a lot of, I don't want to get too much into the, let's say, objections to this, because the objections are, one of the objections that this sort of entails a modal collapse scenario, which means that you can't have contingency, or you can't have like, any possible worlds, right? Everything's just necessary. Another objection by Graham Oppie, I forgot his objection, but my point is, like, there are objections to this argument. Now, as far as me personally, I don't know if the argument works.
All right. How come? Is there a reason why you don't think it works?
Because I haven't looked too much into it, so I can't say one way or the other if it works or not, basically. Okay. And I will, later on, I'll get into what I think about arguments in general, but personally, for me, for this argument, I don't know if it works or not. I should say I'm not persuaded by it, but I'm also not persuaded that it doesn't work. So
now, before we go on, I mean, nothing to do with the subject really, but a little background of you. A lot of people may think, I've been dealing with science and stuff on this channel for a long time, and a lot of people may think just because you believe in God, you're a creationist, but you're not, right?
Oh no, I'm far from a creationist. So, yeah.
So anyone thinking, must be a young Earth creationist, all this stuff, but no, he's not. So
no, I'm far. I am far from it.
So this is not. Yeah. So this is not one of those. Says I'm a God believer and creation is right and evolutionists are stupid and stuff.
None of the arguments I'm presenting here have anything to do with evolution, right? I believe in evolution. I believe it's the best theory we have. These arguments are from the philosophy of religion, right? So these don't come from creationists either, right? These are actual arguments that are discussed in the literature, right? And again, I'll get into the arguments against God later, but okay. I just
I just want to bring up this point. If any of my pro science followers are listening, just because of that thing.
No, that's fine. Anyways, let's go to the next argument, which I think it's cosmological. Okay, so the cosmological argument, I guess a little background. This is I presented two versions of the Kalam. So this is Craig's Kalam. So premise 1, everything that begins to exist is a cause. Premise 2, the universe began to exist. Conclusion, therefore, the universe has a cause. Premise 4, if the universe has a cause, then an uncaused, personal, creator universe exists who sawns the universe into existence and is beginningless, changeless, immaterial, timeless, spaceless, whatever, enormously powerful. Therefore, an uncaused, personal, creator universe exists. This is, I just want to clarify that this argument right here, the one on the left, is Craig's Kalam. There is a lot of stuff in the literature on this version. And me personally, I will say that I am not convinced of this argument right here. Now, the reason why I'm not convinced, at least of this version of the argument, is because it depends on the premise 1. Okay, because in the philosophy of time specifically, there are debates about whether or not time even exists. Right?
Is this is this one of the things that people like the anti-Big Bangers theories talk about? People.
Well, it's weird because Craig actually uses the Big Bang to support premise 2 of the argument.
Okay.
So Craig, William Lane Craig in this case, because he's the one that developed at least this version of the argument, is using modern science to support the premises of the argument.
Right? I mean, is that the? That's not familiar. Is he an OEC?
I think so.
Okay, yeah, that name sounds familiar.
Yeah, I think he's an old Earth creationist. Although I'm not sure if he accepts. I think he does accept evolution. Maybe he doesn't like. I don't know. Maybe he accepts I know he accepts some version of evolution. I'm not sure like which one though, because there's a lot
But
of.
he accepts that the
different ones.
Earth is 14 billion years old and not.
Yeah, no, he accepts that.
That
Yeah,
much. Okay.
he's not a creationist at all. So, anyway, so then we have version 2 of the Kalam, which says there exist entities that 1 are members of a temporal causal series and 2 began to exist. Premise 2, everything that begins to exist is a cause. Premise 3, if there is an entity that 1 is a member of a temporal causal series and 2 begins to exist, then there is an uncaused entity. There isn't an X which is uncaused and beginless, there is an X which is uncaused and beginless. If X is uncaused and beginless, nothing exists prior to it and therefore is the first cause. Therefore, X is the first cause. Now, with these okay, so another clarification here. I actually think that this version of the argument is better because it doesn't rely on problematic views about the nature begins to exist, right? So this could work with any theory of time, right? So regardless of which view in the philosophy of time you hold, you could accept any premise in this argument. It's only this argument that I think is problematic. But again, I wanted to present these two versions to sort of point out that even if this version doesn't work, you still have a lot of others that are less problematic, I should say.
Okay.
So this is a first cause argument, right? And a first cause argument just argues that there's a first cause to reality. And so then you would have to do a sort of conceptual analysis to show why this first cause is God, right? But again, people will disagree on that conclusion, right? I'm not going to pretend like I would be lying if I told you that there are not objections to the arguments. There are plenty of objections to these arguments, right? But I just want to point out that the arguments themselves are sort of talked about in the literature and stuff. So now we're going to go into contingency arguments, which do not rely on first causes. So premise 1, reality in total is self-sufficient with no outside cause or explanation. Premise 2, nothing can be self-sufficient without a perfect foundation. Conclusion, therefore reality has a perfect foundation. Premise 4, I misspelled perfect here. This perfect foundation is what we call a perfect God. Therefore, a perfect God exists.
So this paper foundation.
Yeah, I meant to say perfect. I screwed up on that part. But so these arguments are from Joshua Rasmussen. Now, I actually think premise 1 is, I think, this true by logical necessity. So the way that Rasmussen argues for premise 1 is like this. Let's say you view all reality as like a blob of everything, right? Think of everything that exists as a blob of everything, okay? Now try to identify something that exists beyond that. Well, you can't, because by definition, the blob of everything is all that exists, right? If you say that there's something that exists beyond the blob of everything, then that thing would have to be part of the blob of everything, right? And so therefore, by necessity, the blob of everything is self-sufficient. There is no outside cause or explanation for everything, right? So that's the support of the first premise. Now, the second premise is probably going to be the most controversial, okay? Which is that nothing can be self-sufficient without a perfect foundation. And what I mean by perfect in this context is something that has no arbitrary limits, or something that is supreme in its nature, right? Something that's omnipotent, or godlike, essentially, right? So the way that Rasmussen argues for a perfect foundation, I mean, there's different ways you could go about it, but one of the ways is he has this principle called the principle of no arbitrary limits. So whatever the ultimate explanation of reality is cannot have limits, right? Or at least the best explanation for all limits is that there is something that has no limits, right? So it can't have limits in its nature. It can't have limits in the amount of particles it possesses, right? I don't even think it would have particles anyways. It also couldn't have like finite degrees of quantities, right? So something that's perfect, right? Something that has no limit to its power, right? It's something that's perfect, right? So that would be the conclusion. Now, I actually do think that this argument goes through. I defended this argument in my video on the perfect foundation. I go more into detail there. So this is an argument that I do think is successful. But again, I want to let viewers know that there are objections to this argument, right? So especially premise 2, I think there's a lot of interesting objections to that one. But anyways, so the next argument is the one on the right, which is also by Rasmussen. So it says premise 1, aiming for truth is valuable. I think that's pretty.
So who is Rasputin again?
Joshua Rasmussen, he's a philosopher.
Okay.
He's written a few books on the existence of God. He wrote a book on how reason can lead to God, which I highly recommend for anybody, regardless if you believe in God or not. I think you should read it. But yeah, these two arguments come from him. So premise 1, aiming for truth is valuable. Premise 2, if aiming for truth is valuable, then generally speaking, aiming for truth is more likely to lead to true beliefs. Premise 3, if generally speaking, if aiming for truth is more likely to lead to true beliefs, then some explanation of any given data is more likely than no explanation, all others being equal. Therefore, any given data probably has some explanation, all else being equal. So this is just arguing for a sort of like explanatory principle, where if it seems like there's a further explanation for something, then there should be a further explanation for something, right? But then, of course, you run into a problem, right? Where the foundation for reality has no explanation, right? It has no explanation, but that's because it has no arbitrary limits and has no unexplained limits, right? So what explains why the foundation has no explanation is because by its nature, it can't have an explanation, right? But the very fact that its nature is unlimited, right, means that it cannot have any unexplained or no limits, or at least no unexplained limits. So that means if it does have limits, then there must be an explanation for why it has limits, right? So let's say, like, one example is like the Trinity, right? If you say, oh well, why is God 3 persons? Well, it's like, well, I think you can explain that through the nature of love, right? But that's not an unexplained limit, right? You can actually explain the limits in that case, right? And so premise 5, a foundation with less than maximal supreme existence has an arbitrary unexplained limit. So I actually think that premise 5 is going to be the most contentious, right? Because it's like, well, what do you mean by supreme? First of all, well, again, supreme just means something without limits, right? So if there is some like unexplained limit within the nature of something, right, then it's not going to be the foundation for reality. So the foundation for reality, if it has no explanation, sort of has to have no arbitrary limits, right? Therefore, the foundation has maximal supreme existence. So, that would just lead to God, right, existing.
Yeah.
So that's what I would. That's the argument that he used on the Supreme Foundation. His argument for the Supreme Foundation. I also think that this argument goes through, but I do admit that there needs to be at least more work done in the argument. But again, it's Rasmussen. He's a really good philosopher. So, anyways, so now let's go into a teleological argument.
What does that stand for?
That has to do with fine tuning, right? So, I apologize. I did not. When I made this, I must have really screwed up, because this is not how you spell fine tuning. But anyways, fine tuning of the initial state of the universe.
Define tuning.
Yeah. Fine tuning.
Is that like the argument? Like when they said, like a clock has a designer, so the Earth has a designer.
No. So this has to do with the laws of nature themselves.
Okay.
Right. Fine tuning, if there is. So let me also clarify, because one of the objections to fine tuning is that there's a multiverse, right? So the problem with that is a multiverse would itself have to be fine tuned, right? Uh,
And we're not talking about like a multiverse, like an MCU alternate universe multiverse.
I'm talking about like an infinite multiverse, right?
Okay.
Now, what you could do is this. You could say, well, fine tuning is just a brute fact, right? But then the problem there is that's just going to make your hypothesis very complex, right? Now, could it work? Yes. Which is why, I'll get into this more later, but the fine tuning itself is not like, I wouldn't say that it's the best evidence for God, but I do think that it has weight, basically. And this argument in particular, this is a deductive argument, right? So I actually don't think that this argument goes through because I don't think any deductive arguments go through, but I don't want to get too much into that now, but yeah. So the fine-tuning universe and the initial state of the universe is due neither to necessity nor chance. Therefore, the fine-tuning of the initial state of the universe is due to God. So premise 2 says that it is not due to necessity and is not due to chance that the laws of nature are the way they are. And so therefore the fine-tuning would is due to God, right? Due to a sort of designer that designed the laws in a specific way, right? Now, this argument in particular is a basic form of the argument. There are countless others, right? I don't have time to get into because it would take me forever. But this is just one version of a teleological or fine-tuning argument, right? There's plenty of others in literature that discuss this more. So now let's go into moral argument. Premise 1, if objective moral values and duties exist, then God does not exist. If objective moral values and duties do not exist, then God does not exist. Objective moral values and duties do exist, therefore God exists. I actually don't think that this argument goes through either, but that's because I think premise 1 is special pleading. But again, I don't want to get too much into the objections. There are other versions of the moral argument in the literature, but again, there are objections to those arguments, right? And so this leads me to my next point, right? Arguments against God, right? Well, what are the arguments against God? Well, here are a few examples. One of them is the arguments from evil, right? And I have two different versions of this. So the first version is this: if there are any actually gratuitous evils, then God does not exist. And a gratuitous evil in this context has to do with how should I say? It has to do with any evil that has no greater good. It's basically a pointless evil, right? Premise 2, the suffering of a fawn of a forest fire with no one around to help or learn from the experience is seemingly gratuitous. Premise 3, we can warrantly infer the likely gratuitous nature of the fawn suffering in the forest fire from its seemingly gratuitous nature. Therefore, God is unlikely to exist. Now, this argument is actually inductive, right? So it's not a deductive argument, which means that even if the premises are all true, that doesn't mean that therefore the conclusion leads, to you saying that God doesn't exist. It just says it's unlikely that God exists. So the probability is just not that high, right? Another version of the argument from evil, it doesn't specifically say evil, but it has to do with the data of good and evil, right? So premise 1, naturalism is much simpler than theism. Okay. Premise 2, naturalism has much more predictive power than theism with respect to the data of good and evil. That is, with respect to what we know about the distribution and relative quantities of physical pain and pleasure, flourishing and faltering, virtue, vice, triumph, and tragedy. Premise 3, any epistemic advantages that theism has over naturalism, i.e., any factors that raise the ratio probability of theism to the probability of naturalism, do not, even when combined, serve to offset the epistemic advantages that naturalism has over the theism, and premises 1 and 2 are true. So theism is probably false. Now, I actually think that the only premise that theists, I think, have any sort of way to argue against is premise 2, right? So what the theist has to do is they have to bring a theodicy. So they have to explain why is it that there is evil, or why do we see the data of good and evil in the way we do, right?
Yeah.
There are a few theodicies out there. One of them is Trent Dowdery's work on animal pain. Another one is Joshua Rasmussen's work on what's it called? I forgot. Oh yeah, the story theodicy. There's a few others out there as well, but basically, I think the theist is going to have to either argue that naturalism is not simpler than theism, or they're going to have to argue that naturalism does not have that much predictive power over theism when it comes to the data of good and evil, right? So, as a theist, of course, I don't think these arguments go through. I will say that right up front. But I do think that these provide good challenges to theism. And I presented these two arguments because I believe that these two arguments are the best versions of the problem of evil in the literature, at least for now. So, like, the left one has to do with Cthulhu's suffering, and this one is Paul Draper's argument, right? And I think that this, especially premise two, that's where a lot of the debate goes into, right? So these are arguments from evil. Again, these are not logical arguments from evil, right? I mean, those exist as well. So there are deductive forms of these arguments, but these are sort of inductive forms, which I think have more weight, honestly. But anyways, so the final argument against God, again, there are much more. I don't have time to get into it, but argument from divine hiddenness. If there is a God, he's perfectly loving. Premise two, if a perfectly loving God exists, reasonable non-belief does not occur. Reasonable non-belief occurs, therefore no perfectly loving God exists. So this argument is argued from Schellenberg, and I don't know, there's a lot of literature on this.
Who's Schellenberg?
He's an atheist philosopher.
Okay.
He presented this argument, I think, back in the 80s or something. I can't remember the exact time, but yeah, there's a lot of literature on this.
So, like this is like saying that a perfectly loving God wouldn't have drowned people in the flood type of situation thing.
Well, that would be a problem. That would be an argument from evil. What this is talking about is reasonable non-belief. So why is it that reasonable non-belief even exists, right? So basically, it has to do with, well, if God actually exists, why doesn't he make his existence more obvious, right? That's where the argument, I think, has reasonable force. Although, again, as a theist, I don't think this argument goes through. Again, I have to be consistent with what I believe, but I do think that the argument has force. So just like these arguments, right, I also think that this argument has force. And the reason why I'm presenting them is for people to realize that there are good arguments on both sides, right? It's not all, like, the theist doesn't have all the eggs, essentially, right? There are good arguments on both sides. So now we're going to get into what's the point, right? Well, the point is that there are hundreds of arguments, right? There are literally hundreds of arguments for and against God, right? If you want more information on arguments for God, there is a presentation by Capturing Christianity that goes over a lot of I think it's like 150 arguments for God in literature. And then if you want arguments against God, you can look at Ex-Apologists, and he has a lot of good resources on arguments against God, which, again, they're talking like hundreds, right? And they both have good evidential weight, right?
Yes.
So the question is, how do we evaluate these arguments, right? How do you even look at these arguments? Because, I mean, you're talking hundreds, right? So this is my proposal, okay? We have to first understand limitations of arguments, okay? The problem is that if both sides be consistent, which I think they are, then they're just going to reject the opponent's argument, right? They're just going to reject any argument that leads one to false beliefs, right? And so they only need to reject one of the premises, and that's it, right? If I present an argument for God, and if the atheist, if he rejects one of my premises, that's it, right? The argument's finished, right? Now we could say this, that rejecting one of the premises is problematic, but sometimes there are cases where, given the prior theory, right, which I'll get into later, but given the prior theory that each side holds to, it would actually be rational to reject one or more of the premises, right? So there are both positive and negative aspects to arguments, right? So the positive would be this. Number one, an argument can be used to reach a conclusion for certain premises, right? Which helps to discover something new. Another reason why an argument is good is because it can be used to show an inconsistency in someone's worldview. So if the theist accepts all the premises in an argument against God, then the theist is being inconsistent. And if the naturalist accepts all the arguments in a premise in an argument for God, right, then the naturalist is being inconsistent, right? So let's say I present, I don't know, like let's say an atheist comes to me and presents an argument from evil, right? Let's just say I accept all the premises. Well, I mean, I'm being inconsistent with my beliefs in that case, right?
So you're saying you think there's a counter argument for each side?
Yeah, well, that's the point,
Argument. Okay.
right? That's the limit, right? Is that any argument you bring forth is going to have prior metaphysical commitments or ethical commitments in the in the case of the problem of evil, right? And so the problem is that arguments are not good for dialogue, right? If both sides want to reach the truth together, if we're only focused on arguments themselves, then it is doubtful whether we can make any progress because each side is going to doubt like any premises, right? That's inconsistent with the worldview that they hold, right? And so while there are many arguments for and against the existence of God, they all have limitations. So like the Kalam cosmological argument, for example, right? It relies on causal finitism, right? And so that's a metaphysical assumption about the impossibility of causal infinities. So if I let's say I'm let's say that I present the Kalam to somebody, right? And let's just say that they accept that causal infinities are possible, right? Well, my argument's not going to go through, right? Because in that case, a first cause is not going to even exist, right? And so the point, and then of course with the older arguments, so like if you go to the Aristotelian proof or Aquinas' 5 ways, they rely on background assumptions, right, related to the metaphysical systems that they operate in, right? So, like for example, like Aquinas' 5 ways would not work if like existential inertia is true, right? And so my point here is that the arguments, all of them, right, regardless if they're for or against God, all the arguments, okay, no matter which premises you put in there, they all rely on prior metaphysical assumptions. They all rely on prior what's called theories, right? The arguments only work in the context of their metaphysics. And so one has to establish that these metaphysical systems are actually true, right? If we can establish that these metaphysical systems are true, then we can make a successful argument for God. You can show that God exists, right? But that's only if you accept the metaphysics that the argument relies on, right? And so this is why it's important, okay, that we examine the metaphysical systems as a whole when investigating these sorts of philosophical disputes. So we need to make a comparative assessment of these metaphysical systems, right? So this gets into this whole idea called and this is the same view that Graham Oppie holds, but basically that theories come prior to arguments, right? So we shouldn't be focused on arguments. So all the arguments I just presented for and against God don't really matter until you've established your theory first, right? It's a theorist first approach. Okay.
And this is correct. We're talking about theories here. These aren't like scientific theories, totally different. The other kind.
These are metaphysical theories.
Okay.
Right. So what should be going on? Well, this is what should be going on. In order to assess the probability of theism, we need to compare with naturalism as a metaphysical theory, not a scientific theory, right?
Yeah.
So you have to ask, like, how better is theism able to account for the circumstances by which we find our world in? What predictions does theism and naturalism make that don't require ad hoc assumptions? And then how simple is theism and naturalism in their fundamental commitments, right? So these sorts of questions are metaphysical in their nature, right? These are metaphysical questions we need to ask, right? So my proposal is this: we use theoretical virtues, right? So these are the 4 virtues that I, especially my studies on the philosophy of science in particular, these are the 4 virtues that I think encompass all of science, right? And I also think that these virtues should also be applied to metaphysics, right, as well. So just a quick summary of each of the virtues. Oh, by the way, how long did you want to go?
I don't have a time limit.
You don't?
It's how long you can talk or have time
perfect.
to talk.
Okay, good. Because there is a lot I have to say on these virtues, so I'll get started then. So the first virtue is explanatory predictive accuracy, which basically, I mean, it's self-explanatory, right? It's just the criteria requires us to expect with accuracy many and varied events by which we observe. This means that any theory that we build must be able to explain phenomena in the proper way, and this requires that the theory accurately predicts phenomena. So again, that's probably the most easiest to understand. This is just, explanatory power, right? Although I do think that we'll get into explanatory flexibility, or ideal explanatory flexibility later, but that's basically what it is, at least for this. Then there's explanatory simplicity, right? So this has to do with parsimony, right? So parsimony includes both quantitative parsimony, which is that all else being equal, an explanation that posits fewer individual entities is preferable to an explanation that posits more. And then there's qualitative parsimony, which is that all else being equal, an explanation that posits fewer kinds of entities is preferable to an explanation that posits more. And so additionally, there's also, Occam's razor, Occam's laser, right? So Occam's razor is the idea that we should not posit unnecessary entities beyond necessity. And then Occam's laser is that we should not posit unnecessary fundamental entities beyond necessity, right? So there's a little bit difference there, but I mean, it's going by the same basic principle, right? Where you want to make sure that your theory is simple, right? Make sure you're not positing any extra, assumptions.
The two things like act as their Sid name acts, like a razor or a laser.
Yeah, they do. It's very similar. So the razor, that's talking about your entities, but then what the laser is talking about fundamental entities. So there is a little bit difference there.
Okay.
So the reason I actually think that the laser is more relevant to metaphysics in general, because that is talking about ultimate reality. But yeah, you want to make sure that you're not positing unnecessary fundamental entities. So make sure you're not, basically, you don't want to build in into your theory to make it, seem like it has predictive power, which I'll get more into how that works when we go into flexibility. But this is just the basic idea, at least for parsimony. And then, of course, the other aspect of explanatory simplicity is what I call simple unification, right? This basically means that given our total model of reality, which is all of the webs of inferential relations that exist, that constitute our base of knowledge, if we synthesize as closely as possible in order to produce a more comprehensive body of knowledge, right? And so this has to do with what I call the principle of simple unification, which is that any set of explanations, with any set of explanations, there's a simple root or fact that unifies this set of explanations, right? So basically means that if you have any explanations, right, that they can all be sort of unified and made sense of, right, without like, you don't want a theory that like has all these different sets of explanations, but then there's nothing that like connects them all. Basically, you want to make sure that there's a sort of unified aspect to the explanations that you're putting forth, right? And so with a metaphysical explanation, this sets up the final stop point for explanation, right? A grand theory of reality positing the fewest fundamental entities would accomplish simple unification, and this would, naturally simplify the entire theory and thus simplify the lower level phenomena that it is explaining, right? So I would say that the best kind of stop point for explanation is an explanation in terms of the simplest kind of entity with the simplest kind of properties and features, and the explanation that stops with a kind of thing with the simplest internal structure. So you want to make sure that it's simple in the kind of thing it is, simple in the entity it is, or the features that it has, and make sure that its internal structure is also simple as well, right?
Okay.
And so this is, typically a model which has simple unification is the model that leaves us with the least amount of explanatory questions. So we can't keep asking, okay, well, what explains this or that, right? Well, an explanation, if your theory, like for example, if well, I don't want to provide any examples because I might seem too biased, but basically you want to make sure that your theory, like when you ask, hey, well, why stop here and not something there, right? One idea behind this is that you want to make sure that whatever your ultimate explanation is, that you can't ask further questions. So you can't ask, okay, well, why does it have this property or that property, right? Well, it's like, well, the reason, what explains the final explanation is not going to be anything relatively different from that final explanation, right? So that's what I would say, basically, that you want to make sure that your theory So like whatever is foundational to your theory, make sure that whatever explains that, whatever can in principle explain it, make sure that whatever explains it is not relatively different from whatever your foundation is, right? So for example, if you say that, I don't know, a quantum field, let's say, oh, well, a quantum field, that's just the foundation of reality. Okay, there's no further explanation. Well, in that case, you could ask, okay, well, what explains why it has unlike properties? What explains why it has these certain limits to it? What explains, why can it only produce this kind of universe rather than another, right? If you're gonna say, oh well, there's just laws of nature that are just built into it, and so that explains why it does this thing rather than another thing, well, that's not going to be the best stopping point for explanation, right? That's not going to explain why the quantum field exists, right? There's going to have to be a deeper explanation for that, right? At least metaphysically speaking. So I mean, again, this criteria only applies when we're talking about ultimate reality. When we're talking like higher level phenomena, obviously I don't think you don't have to apply it there, but yeah, that's all I have to say on that. So now here comes, I think this next virtue is like one of the most misunderstood virtues of all time, and that is flexibility. Okay, and it's funny because this is actually what eventually led me out of creationism, but and I think you understand why. So you want to make sure that your theory has explanatory flexibility. What this means is that the model is able to respond to evidence and be modified accordingly. Ideal explanatory flexibility negotiates between two extremely undesirable properties possessed by bad models, right? The first of these extremes regarding bad theories is a theory that is extremely hostile towards modification. So this is the theory that dogmatically maintains its commitments about the world, even in the face of strong contradictory evidence. So one example of that would be creationism, right? Where just hold on to its commitments, right? Even in the face of strong contradictory evidence, right? Or maybe like the global flood, right? I mean, obviously there's strong evidence against there being a global flood, right? But people, the creationists still want to hold to that view, right? So they hold to their view even in the face of strong contradictory evidence, right? And so the point is that such a theory is unresponsive to evidence because it is unable to be extended to account for new data that contradicts its core commitments. Right.
Yeah,
So,
I think I think personally that their argument to stand their ground about the flood and all that other stuff is driving more people away from them than bringing them towards them. In my opinion, at least.
And so there's that extreme, right? But then the other extreme is this, right? The second extreme is that it becomes so flexible that it becomes ad hoc. And so a theory that incorporates every single piece of contradictory evidence into its program by interpreting the evidence in ad hoc fashion to give the deceptive appearance that the theory's predictions have been fulfilled is a theory that is not ideally flexible.
So like a big crossover that has no something that so many crossovers that has no sense of what it originally was to begin with. You mean something like that?
Yeah. So like one example might be, oh well, it's just a miracle, like God caused all these miracles to occur during the flood that it made it appear, as if there's no evidence for a global flood, right?
Okay. Oh.
And so the problem is that a theory with too much flexibility is a theory that has the theoretical viciousness of being ad hoc. So an ad hoc theory, we're talking about the nature of ad hocness, is a theory that artificially adds additional assumptions. But then these assumptions are not themselves derivable from within the contents of the theory, right? So you have to add it in, basically, right? And so the models which share these two characteristics, so the model that is hostile towards evidence, and also the model that's ad hoc, right, are models that are unfalsifiable. Basically, there's no possible way to falsify these theories, basically, right? And so the point is that a model that has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that negotiates between these two extremes, right? A model which has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that does not blindly ignore contradictory evidence, nor does it try to recontextualize its contradictory evidence in a ad hoc fashion. Such a model would respond to contradictory evidence either by recontextualizing its own contents and commitments to accommodate new evidence via the process called paradigm shifting, or being thrown out altogether through the process called falsification, right? And so a model that has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that is able to grow our total body of knowledge, or what is commonly, termed as a sort of like research project, right? And if you look at science, right, I mean, that's basically what science is, at least today, right? The reason why we still believe in evolution is because evolution is great at flexibility, right? And so our models were able to accommodate new evidence without being ad hoc, right? So it was able to like expand our body of knowledge, basically, right?
Like everything built upon each other.
Right. And so you want to make sure that your theory, a good theory, is one that has flexibility so that it becomes a research project, right? It can't be a research project without it being ideally flexible, right? If it's not flexible, it's not going to be a research project, basically, is what I'm saying, right?
Yeah.
And so basically, a theory that has ideal explanatory flexibility is a model that is able to respond to evidence in a way that doesn't demand it to ignore evidence and doesn't demand any extra ad hoc assumptions be built into the model. And so the model and the theory is able to expand our body of knowledge, right? And of course, be research projects. So I hope that helps clarify, like, why the philosophy of science here is important, right? You want to make sure that your model, not only that it's simple, right? Not only that it predicts things, but also that it's flexible, right? And of course, the final criteria is basically just, make sure that your model is, doesn't have contradictions, basically, right? I mean, that's pretty self-explanatory, but yeah. So my point is that a good theory is one that follows these virtues, right? And this leads me to my final comparison, which is comparing the methods, right? So this will be my closing, not my closing slide, but sort of two ways you could do this, right? So one way to do this is what I call the top-down approach, where worldviews come prior to theories, where you want to minimize your commitments and maximize explanations about your beliefs, about your worldview, right? So worldview, of course, is everything you believe, right? So in this case, you say that your worldview is to be true as your theory. So we start off with all your beliefs about the world and then do our theory building. So a worldview, for example, that has less ontological, ideological, and theoretical commitments is better than a worldview that has more. And so the worldview which has less beliefs part of it is the worldview that's better. And so when it comes to explanatory power, we also want to like sort of axiomatize our theory, right? Sorry. So this means that any axioms we have for our worldview will carry on the general commitments of the worldview. And so anything that is a logical consequence of the axioms is anything that we get for free. And so anything that, of course, that we don't get for free are what's called primitives, right? Because there is no logical entailment from the axioms to the theory to our beliefs about it, right? One good example of this is like cats, right? So my beliefs about cats are not derivable from my axiom of my theory. And so that's just going to be a primitive, right? The top-down comparison is the comparison that Graham Oppy uses in his book, The Best Argument Against God. He's an atheist philosopher. He uses this comparison to argue that naturalism is the better view. Obviously, I don't agree with him, but which leads me to my other view, which is that theories come prior to worldviews. We want to minimize commitments and maximize explanation about fundamental reality, right? So it's not about your beliefs. It's about your fundamental reality. It's about what are you positing as fundamental reality. And so this constrains your beliefs about reality. And so your theory should be treated as a worldview. This takes the opposite approach of the top-down because you do not start off with your beliefs and treat them as your ideological, ontological, and theoretical commitments. Rather, you begin with your theory the same way that all theories are built, by positing the fewest explanatory regularities. You begin with a theory which has the fewest explanatory commitments rather than all of your commitments or beliefs about the world. Doing it like this, one begins with a certain substance and then what can be most likely produced from it, right? And so then you would use the other virtues like explanatory power, explanatory simplicity, explanatory flexibility, so forth. But obviously, as a theist, right, I'm going to take the bottom-up comparison. because I think that's how the philosophy of science is done. I don't think that you start off with your beliefs and then try to reduce everything there. I think that you start off with positing, right, fundamental regularities, right, and then you see, okay, well, what are we to expect from the thing we are positing, right?
Okay.
So I do admit that I prefer a bottom-up approach, right? This is the approach that I think works best with the philosophy of science. I think that all scientific theories work in the exact same way. I don't think that scientific theories work in this way, which is top-down. I believe all of science works this way. Again, maybe there's some reasonable disagreement on that. People have different views, right? But these are the two general views that one could take. Again, I prefer the bottom-up approach, but that doesn't mean that other people have to, right? So yeah. So the final thing, of course, is how should a theist argue for God? Well, number one, you build a theory, right, which is the bottom-up approach. So you do this, right? Then two, you use the theoretical virtues to compare with naturalism. So again, the virtues are these four things, right? You use these virtues. And then once you've done those virtues, you make a case for why those virtues favor theism against naturalism. That's how, in my opinion, theists should argue for God. I don't think that theists should be using arguments, although I do think that arguments are useful. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I think that if you're going to believe in God, if you want to argue for the existence of God, you should basically do what scientists do, right? You should build a theory, right, and see how is theism as a hypothesis, how is that explaining anything, right, about the world. I think if you do that, then I think you could make a reasonable case for God. And I don't think that naturalism, at least as a theory, does better. I think that theism does better. But yeah. And of course, my final note is that if someone is agnostic and say, like, let's say, well, I just don't know whether God exists, right? Well, then in that case, I mean, my response to them would just be like, well, I mean, that's fine, but I mean, you need to provide a rival theory, right? If you want to reject theism, you're going to have to like provide a better view, right? So that's what I would say. But
Okay.
let me see if I could. How do I? Stop. I'm just going to stop sharing because.
All right. So how much time did you come up with your we'll call it the Kyle theory?
Okay, so I don't have his book with me like up here. So there's this book. Let me grab it real quick. Hold on.
We'll be back after these messages. There are no messages.
Okay.
Now return to our show already in progress.
Sorry. Okay, so this is where you begin. Okay. I'm joking. I was about to say just read Richard Swinburne, but he does something that I've adopted, right? Where you first this is what you do. You first examine the nature of the philosophy of science. Okay. You see how a scientific theory is built, right? And then you translate that into metaphysics, right? So when you're talking about metaphysical stuff, right, about the nature of ultimate reality, then you begin, okay, well, what do I have to posit, right? What do I start off with, right, in my theory? In my case, as a theist, I would say that you start off with the property of absolute perfection. You start with one property. Now, that is the only thing you have to build in, right? You have to build in something, right? Obviously, for any theory, you're going to have to posit something to exist, right? You posit that. What you could do from there is then you could argue, I would say deductively, that God's going to have certain properties, right? God's going to be all powerful. God's going to be all knowing. God's going to be all loving, right? And then from there, once you're finished with that, then you look at what is the nature of value, right? What are valuable things? So when you connect the nature of God with the nature of value, then you could deduce from there that God would only create worlds which have the most value, right? Once you do that, then you could deduce, okay, well, if God's going to create worlds which have the most value, then you could sort of predict the type of world we live in, right? From the hypothesis, right? You could predict that God's going to create certain things, right? If you want more detail on this, I did a video. It's called The Explanatory Power of Theism, where I actually, one of the first things I do is I go over the nature of explanation. So I explain how we explain things. You know, how do explanations work within the philosophy of science? Then I go over what's called scientific naturalism, which tries to preclude theism. Then I argue against that view. Then I conclude, with saying, okay, well, we need to treat this as a metaphysical hypothesis, right? We should not treat this as a purely empirical endeavor, right? Once we've done that, then you could argue that theism sort of makes certain predictions about the world, like maximal value, right, or certain values, right? I'm working on a video right now on what's called the explanatory flexibility of theism, which is that how is theism able to be a research project? So my method is very much in line with not only with what Swinburne says, but also I think what science in general just makes obvious to me.
So you've seen his videos. I'll leave a description. I'll leave a link in the description below, and you also click his name in the title section with YouTube's clickable title thing, so you can do that if you want to see what Kyle here is all about.
Yeah. But yeah, my next video is going to be on the explanatory flexibility of theism, which has to do mainly with it's going to have to do with how is theism able to account for contradictory evidence without being ad hoc, basically. So
okay.
So yeah.
So
any questions? Or
not that I can think of it right at the moment. That's usually my thing. It takes me a while to process stuff. If anybody in chat, I see 4 people are watching right now. So if anybody in chat has any questions, speak now, forever hold your peace. unless you say in the comments later on. But comments, you know how it is. Post video comments are harder to reply to than live comments. So it's your chance to talk to the man himself right now. So besides that, you have any other interviews coming up in your channel you want to advertise besides the one you just talked about?
No, although I am tomorrow night I will be concluding my my reaction to the Grand Moppy debate with Castro. So there's that. But other than that, I'm not really sure. Other than my Primeval video. So yeah.
Well, for me, this Sunday is my season 9 finale of the podcast and also my 300th episode. So been around for a while. So
yeah.
So check that out. Like I said before the start of this, Kyle was a guest on season 3. So like 2015, I think. So that's been a long time.
No, I mean, I think the last one was when we're talking about Genesis.
Oh yeah, that was like 2 years. Oh yeah, 2 years ago. That was season 7. Yeah, you're right. You're season 7 where you're talking about the problems with Genesis 1 theory or something like that. Yeah, back then. Yeah, also a good thing. Check him out there. But yeah, other than that, basically my procrastinating Let's Play videos I have. So if there's no questions, do you have anything that you say when you sign off on your videos?
No.
You have a closing statement or anything?
I don't have any closing statements.
No catchphrases. All right. Well, I'll see you all Sunday. And in the meantime, never stop learning. Enjoy the randomness. Never forget to always think.